Good evening and welcome. Tonight we are going to travel back in time to discover the story of one of the most famous landmarks on Earth, the Eiffel Tower. You know its shape, you've seen it on postcards, in films, or perhaps even in person. It is more than a monument. It is a symbol of Paris, of France, and of human ingenuity. But what is less well known is how controversial, how daring, and how unlikely its story really was. When you look at the Eiffel Tower today, it seems as if it has always belonged to the Paris skyline. But in truth, its beginning was met with outrage, even hatred. Many Parisians saw it as ugly, a stain on the beauty of their city. Writers and artists signed petitions calling it a monstrosity. At the same time, its construction was a feat of engineering unlike anything the world had ever seen. It rose higher than any structure before it, made of over 18,000 pieces of iron, bolted and riveted together by brave workers standing hundreds of feet in the air. And behind this tower stood one man, Gustave Eiffel. He was already known as a master of metalwork, a builder of bridges and train stations, but this project would test his vision and his reputation like never before. And as fate would have it, while the tower was rising, Eiffel himself was being dragged down into one of the largest scandals of the 19th century, the collapse of the Panama Canal project. In 1 year, he became both celebrated and disgraced. Tonight we will walk through this journey step by step, from the grand dreams of the 1889 World's Fair, to the muddy foundations along the Seine, to the iron beams that climbed higher than any human had ever dared to build. We will see how the tower was hated, how it was nearly torn down, and how it survived through 2 world wars to become the symbol of Paris itself. So settle in, make sure to click the like and subscribe buttons, make yourself comfortable, and let the story unfold. This is the history of the Eiffel Tower. The story of the Eiffel Tower begins not with Gustave Eiffel himself, but with a celebration. The year was 1889, and Paris was preparing for an event of global proportions, the Exposition Universelle, the World's Fair. This would not be just any exhibition. It was planned as the grandest the world had ever seen, designed to commemorate the centennial of the French Revolution, 100 years since the storming of the Bastille. For France, it was a chance to remind the world of its enduring spirit of liberty, equality, and fraternity. World's fairs in the 19th century were spectacles of progress. They were where nations unveiled their proudest achievements, from machines that changed industries to inventions that changed daily life. London had dazzled the globe in 1851 with the Crystal Palace, a vast greenhouse of glass and iron that symbolized the new industrial age. Philadelphia had staged a remarkable fair in 1876, celebrating America's centennial with giant steam engines and telephone demonstrations. Paris itself had already hosted successful expositions, most notably in 1878, when electric lighting amazed visitors strolling along the boulevards at night. But by 1889, competition between nations was fierce. Each wanted to prove that it stood at the forefront of science, industry, and culture. The French government knew it could not afford to offer a modest display. Paris was still regarded as the capital of art, fashion, and ideas. Yet its leaders wanted something more, a structure so bold that it would outshine London's Crystal Palace, so dramatic that it would draw millions of visitors, and so modern that no one could deny France's place at the heart of progress. To achieve this, a competition was announced. architects and engineers across the country were invited to submit designs for a monumental structure to be built on the Champ de Mars, a broad green field in the center of Paris, stretching from the École Militaire to the Seine. It was the perfect stage, central, open, and visible from across the city. Dozens of proposals arrived. Some were extravagant arches adorned with statues and allegories of French history. Others were elaborate towers in the style of classical architecture, reaching upward with stone facades and ornamentation. One idea suggested a giant guillotine, a grim reminder of the Revolution. Another envisioned an enormous water fountain spraying streams high into the air. But among these imaginative, sometimes bizarre suggestions, one stood out for its simplicity and daring. It came from the engineering office of Gustave Eiffel. Eiffel's proposal was for a tower of iron rising to an unprecedented height of 300 meters, almost 1,000 feet. It would be the tallest structure ever built by human hands, dwarfing church spires and even the Great Pyramid of Giza. Its form was not decorative, but structural. 4 great iron legs curved outward like the roots of a tree, rising and narrowing as they joined into a single vertical column. For many, the design seemed shocking. Iron was a material associated with bridges, factories, and railways, not with beauty or monuments. Paris, known for its elegant boulevards and artistic grace, would now be crowned by what some described as a giant black smokestack. The tower, critics feared, would dominate the skyline and ruin the harmony of the city. And yet, for others, the audacity of the idea was irresistible. Eiffel had already proven himself as a master of iron construction. His firm had designed bridges across deep valleys and wide rivers, structures that combined strength with elegance. To his supporters, the tower was not a monstrosity, but a demonstration of French genius, a declaration that the future belonged to modern engineering. Still, the opposition was fierce. As plans for the tower were made public, a storm of protest broke out. A group of prominent artists, writers, and architects signed a petition denouncing the project. Among them were Charles Gounod, the composer, Guy de Maupassant, the novelist, and Charles Garnier, the architect of the Paris Opera. They called the proposed tower useless, monstrous, and a disgrace to Paris. In their eyes, the city of spires and domes, of Gothic cathedrals and Renaissance palaces would be forever spoiled by this iron skeleton. The newspapers echoed their outrage. Caricatures appeared, mocking the design as a giant lamppost, a giraffe, or a factory chimney. Ordinary Parisians were divided. Some were curious, others horrified, and still others indifferent, assuming it would never actually be built. After all, a structure of such height had never been attempted before. Many doubted it could even stand. But behind the controversy, plans moved forward. The government saw in Eiffel's tower not just a bold symbol, but also a practical choice. Unlike ornate stone monuments, an iron structure could be built relatively quickly. It would demonstrate the latest techniques in metal construction, the very methods that were transforming cities and railroads. And perhaps most importantly, it would be a marvel that no visitor to Paris could forget. For Eiffel, the project was both a professional challenge and a personal gamble. He invested much of his own fortune into it, convinced that the tower would secure his place in history. To him, it was not just a fairground attraction, but a laboratory for science. He planned to use it to study wind resistance, the effects of height on air pressure, and even as a possible platform for future technologies like radio transmission. By early 1887, after years of planning and debate, the contract was signed. Gustave Eiffel and his team were given permission to proceed with their radical design. The protests continued, but the decision was made. On the Champ de Mars, in the heart of Paris, Preparations began. Workers cleared the ground. Surveyors measured the soil. Blueprints were finalized. As winter gave way to spring, the people of Paris watched as construction began. Some shook their heads, still convinced that this so-called Iron Tower would collapse under its own weight. Others waited with curiosity, eager to see if this audacious vision could really become reality. Paris had asked for a wonder to crown its World's Fair. Whether they loved it or hated it, the people of the city were about to receive one. To understand the story of the Eiffel Tower, we must pause for a moment and meet the man whose name it bears, Gustave Eiffel. When people today think of him, they often imagine a genius architect, the singular mind behind the tower that became a global icon. But Eiffel was not, strictly speaking, an architect at all. He was an engineer, a builder, and above all, a master of iron. Born in 1832 in the city of Dijon in eastern France, Eiffel grew up in a time of rapid change. France was shifting from a rural society into an industrial one. Railways were being laid across the land, new bridges spanned rivers, and factories produced goods in quantities unimaginable to earlier generations. Young Gustave, curious and precise, developed a fascination for materials and construction. He studied chemistry and engineering and soon found his calling not in laboratories, but in the world of practical building. Eiffel's early career did not begin with towers or monuments. It began with bridges. He had a gift for understanding how iron, a material that was still relatively new in large-scale construction, could be shaped into strong yet graceful structures. At the time, stone was still the traditional choice for bridges and large public works. Iron was considered industrial, perhaps even crude. But Eiffel saw its possibilities. He realized that iron could bear enormous weight if designed correctly, and that it could be assembled into shapes that stone could never achieve. In the 1860s and 1870s, Eiffel's firm took on projects across France and beyond. He designed bridges that leapt across wide valleys and deep gorges with a lightness that seemed almost impossible. One of his most famous was the Gotthardvit Viaduct, a railway bridge in southern France. It soared across the Trier River on a vast iron arch, elegant and strong, and it became one of the engineering marvels of its time. He also left his mark far from France. In Portugal, he built the Maria Pia Bridge over the Douro River, a stunning single-span iron structure that carried trains into the city of Porto. In South America, he oversaw railway bridges in Peru and Chile. His reputation grew as a man who could make the seemingly impossible stand firm in iron. It was not only bridges. Eiffel's company also contributed to buildings that would become famous in their own right. His structural expertise was used in the construction of the framework of the Statue of Liberty, a gift from France to the United States. While sculptor Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi created the figure, it was Eiffel who designed the iron skeleton inside, ensuring that Lady Liberty could withstand wind, weather, and time. That alone might have earned him a place in history. By the 1880s, Gustave Eiffel had become a celebrated figure in the world of engineering. His firm was large, his projects impressive, and his name respected not just in France, but internationally. He had also become known for his meticulousness. Eiffel insisted on precision in calculations, safety in construction, and discipline among his workers. He combined scientific curiosity with a practical understanding of men and machines. Yet Eiffel was not a flamboyant man. He was not the type to court fame or to dazzle with speeches. He preferred to let his work speak for itself. Those who knew him described him as steady, serious, and determined, with an iron will to match the material he loved. He could be stubborn, even inflexible, but he was also visionary. He saw possibilities where others saw obstacles. It was this reputation and this personality that made him the perfect candidate to propose something as audacious as the Eiffel Tower. When the competition was announced for a centerpiece to the 1889 Exposition Universelle, Eiffel's firm had already been thinking about the idea of a very tall iron tower. Two of his senior engineers, Maurice Koechlin and Émile Noguer, had sketched out the concept of a pylon-like structure rising to 300 meters. They imagined it not as mere decoration, but as a demonstration of engineering power. Eiffel, recognizing the boldness of the idea, embraced it and set his firm to refining the design. Of course, Eiffel knew it would not be easy. The tower would face criticism from artists, skepticism from scientists, and doubt from the public. But he also knew that he had the experience to prove it could be done. His bridges had shown how iron could stand across wide gaps. His viaducts had demonstrated how wind could be calculated and resisted. His work on the Statue of Liberty had shown how to build tall, hollow structures with an iron skeleton. All of these experiences fed into the vision of the tower that would bear his name. Eiffel also understood something else. He knew that this tower could be more than just a temporary showpiece for a fair. He envisioned it as a platform for science. He spoke of experiments in aerodynamics, of using the height for meteorological observations, of testing how objects would fall differently from great altitudes. Later, he would even use the tower for pioneering work in radio transmission. But even before the first beam was laid, Eiffel insisted that his tower was not simply decoration, it was a laboratory, a tool for knowledge. This scientific defense would later become crucial in saving the tower from demolition. But in the 1880s, it was enough to convince officials that the project was worthwhile. Eiffel's reputation as a practical builder reassured them. If anyone could make this radical vision stand, it was the quiet, determined engineer from Dijon. As the project moved forward, Eiffel's name became inseparable from the tower. Though many hands contributed to its design and construction, it was his authority, his money, and his risk that carried it forward. He invested much of his own fortune, betting that the tower would pay for itself through visitors and prestige. For Eiffel, the tower was both a culmination and a gamble. It drew on everything he had learned, everything he had built, every calculation and lesson from decades of ironwork. But it also put his reputation on the line. If the tower failed, if it collapsed, or if it became a laughingstock, it would ruin him. If it succeeded, it would crown his career with immortality. As 1887 approached and plans solidified, Gustave Eiffel prepared for the greatest challenge of his life. He was no longer just the builder of bridges. He was about to attempt something far larger, far bolder, and far riskier. The world was watching. Paris was waiting, and Eiffel was ready to leave his mark. When the competition for the centerpiece of the 1889 Exposition Universelle was announced, Paris buzzed with anticipation. The city expected a monument, something grand, dignified, and unmistakably French. Perhaps an arch, adorned with statues of heroes and allegories of liberty. Perhaps a colossal fountain, spraying jets of water into the sky. Or maybe even a temple-like pavilion filled with sculpted symbols of the Revolution's centennial. What almost no one expected was a tower of iron. The proposal from Gustave Eiffel's firm landed on the desks of officials like a thunderbolt. At 300 meters, it was nearly twice the height of anything ever built by human hands. The design was stripped of ornament. No marble statues, no carved facades, no gilded angels. Instead, it was pure structure. 4 iron legs, sloping inward, rising in an open lattice of crisscrossed beams. Where others imagined stone and grandeur, Eiffel's engineers had drawn something skeletal, almost otherworldly. To the eyes of the late 19th century, it was shocking. People were used to bridges and factories being made of iron. But a monument? A symbol of Paris? That seemed absurd. Many Parisians believed monuments should embody elegance, artistry, and harmony with tradition. Iron, to them, was industrial. It belonged in railroads and warehouses, not on the skyline of the City of Light. Yet the government officials reviewing the proposals saw something more. They saw daring. They saw ambition. They saw a structure that, if it could be built, would proclaim to the world that France was still at the forefront of innovation. The tower was chosen. News of the decision spread quickly through Paris, and almost immediately, the backlash began. The city's artists and writers erupted in outrage. In February of 1887, a furious protest was published in the newspaper Le Temps. It was called Protest by Artists Against the Tower of Monsieur Eiffel, and it bore the signatures of some of the most respected cultural figures of the day. Among them were Charles Garnier, architect of the Paris Opera, Guy de Maupassant, the novelist, and Charles Gounod, the composer. Their words were scathing. We, writers, painters, sculptors, architects, and lovers of Paris, until now intact, protest with all our strength, with all our indignation, in the name of French taste, in the name of art and history, against the erection in the very heart of our capital of the useless and monstrous Eiffel Tower. They called it a disgrace, a threat to the beauty of Paris, a giant iron skeleton that would crush the city's charm. They feared that once the tower rose, all of Paris would be dominated by its crude silhouette. How could the delicate spires of Notre Dame, the graceful dome of Les Invalides, or the noble arches of the Louvre compete with a 300-meter iron machine? The critics were relentless. Caricatures flooded the newspapers. Some depicted the tower as a massive smokestack spewing soot across Paris. Others showed it as a grotesque insect towering above the city. Ordinary Parisians, reading these images in columns, were divided. Some agreed wholeheartedly, convinced their beloved city was about to be scarred forever. Others were merely curious, waiting to see if such an audacious plan could really come to life. And yet, amid the outrage, there was also fascination. A few visionaries saw the boldness of the design as its beauty. They admired the sheer nerve of proposing something so different, so unapologetically modern. To them, the tower was a monument to progress, a physical manifestation of France's industrial age. Eiffel himself was not shaken. Calm and methodical, he defended his tower in speeches and writings. He argued that its form was not ugly, but purposeful. Every curve, every beam, every angle was dictated by the laws of engineering. It was designed to withstand the winds, to distribute weight evenly, to rise higher than anything ever built without collapsing. He even compared it to nature. Was the tower any more strange, she asked, than the towering pines of a forest, were the skeletal bones of living creatures? Behind his words was not only confidence, but also strategy. Eiffel knew that his tower would face ridicule, but he also knew that once it was built, it would silence many of its critics. He believed that people needed only to stand beneath it, to climb it, to see the view from its heights, to understand its majesty. Still, the storm of opposition did not fade easily. Writers like Maupassant went out of their way to insult the tower. Legend has it that Maupassant often dined at the restaurant at its base, claiming it was the only place in Paris where he didn't have to see the structure. Whether true or exaggerated, the story reflects the bitterness that many felt. What kept the project alive was not public love, but official resolve. The Exposition Universelle required a centerpiece, and construction was already underway. Eiffel had secured the contract, invested his own money, and mobilized his team of engineers and workers. The storm of words could not stop what was now inevitable. The tower was about to rise. While Gustave Eiffel's tower was beginning to rise on the Champ de Mars, Another story was unfolding, one that threatened to bring his career crashing down. It is one of those strange twists of history where triumph and disgrace arrive at the same time. For Eiffel, the year 1889 would be remembered not only as the year of his greatest achievement, but also the year of his greatest scandal, the Panama Canal disaster. The dream of connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans had fascinated engineers and explorers for centuries. A waterway across the narrow Isthmus of Panama would save ships weeks of dangerous sailing around South America's Cape Horn. Spain had dreamed of it in the 1500s. Explorers had speculated about it ever since, and by the 19th century, the idea had become irresistible. Whoever built the canal would control one of the most important trade routes on Earth. Spain seemed poised to do it. After all, French engineers had already completed the Suez Canal in 1869, cutting a passage through the sands of Egypt and linking the Mediterranean with the Red Sea. The Suez was celebrated as one of the great engineering marvels of the century, and it made its chief promoter, Ferdinand de Lesseps, a national hero. When de Lesseps turned his attention to Panama, the world assumed France would succeed again. In the early 1880s, a French company was formed to dig the canal. De Lesseps envisioned it as a sea-level passage, much like Suez, a straight cut through the land, with no locks or steps. Investors poured money into the project. Ordinary French citizens, from farmers to shopkeepers, bought shares, believing they were investing in a guaranteed triumph. But the reality of Panama was very different from the sands of Egypt. The isthmus was a place of thick jungles, heavy rains, and treacherous terrain. The ground was unstable, with mountains that could not simply be leveled. Landslides buried equipment. Mosquitoes spread deadly diseases, malaria and yellow fever that killed thousands of workers. The conditions were brutal, and progress was painfully slow. By the mid-1880s, it became clear that the original plan for a sea-level canal was impossible. The mountains were too high, the earth too unstable, the diseases too deadly. Costs ballooned. Investors grew restless. To save the project, the company turned to a new idea: a system of locks, giant chambers that would lift and lower ships over the difficult terrain. This is where Gustave Eiffel entered the story. His reputation as a master of iron construction was well known, and he was asked to design the massive lock gates that would make the canal possible. Eiffel accepted. His firm began planning immense iron structures that would stand as tall as buildings and as strong as fortresses. It was exactly the kind of bold engineering challenge he relished. But by then, the project was already doomed. Even with Eiffel's lock system, the canal faced overwhelming obstacles. The company was drowning in debt. Corruption spread as managers tried to cover up the failures and mislead investors. Bribes were paid to politicians and journalists to keep support alive. And in 1889, the company collapsed in bankruptcy. The scandal that followed was one of the largest in French history. Hundreds of thousands of investors lost their savings. The public was outraged. Newspapers called it a national disgrace. Politicians who had taken bribes were exposed. Lawsuits flew. And among those dragged into the affair was Gustave Eiffel. Eiffel was accused of misusing funds related to the lock contracts. Though his involvement was limited compared to others, his fame made him a target. In 1893, he was convicted of fraud and sentenced to 2 years in prison. For a man of his integrity, it was a humiliating blow. He appealed the decision, and the conviction was eventually overturned, but the damage to his reputation was severe. It is striking to realize that while Eiffel was presiding over the completion of his great tower in Paris, he was also being vilified in connection with the disaster in Panama. On the day the tower opened to the public, Eiffel stood triumphant at the summit, a symbol of progress and achievement. Yet behind the scenes, his name was being dragged through courtrooms and headlines. For him, 1889 was a year of dizzying heights and crushing lows. The Panama scandal marked a turning point in his life. Disillusioned, Eiffel gradually withdrew from large-scale construction projects. He turned instead to science, using the Eiffel Tower itself as his laboratory. From its platforms, he conducted experiments on wind resistance, meteorology, and later, radio transmissions. In a sense, the scandal pushed him away from public works and toward a quieter, more reflective career. But history has a way of choosing which stories endure. Today, when people think of Gustave Eiffel, they think of the tower that bears his name, not the scandal that nearly ruined him. The Panama Canal would eventually be built, but not by the French. After years of failure, it was the United States that completed it in the early 20th century, using the very lock system that Eiffel had once envisioned. And so the story of the Eiffel Tower is forever linked, in an odd way, to the story of the Panama Canal. One was a triumph, the other a disaster. Both reveal the daring and risk of 19th century engineering. Both remind us that great ambition often walks hand in hand with great peril. For Gustave Eiffel, the tower was his redemption. While the Panama affair tarnished his name in the courts of his own time, the iron giant he built in Paris rose above scandal. It endured, and today it is the tower, not the trial, that defines his legacy. Every great structure begins with its foundation. Before the Eiffel Tower could rise into the sky, it had to be anchored firmly to the ground. And that ground, unfortunately, was not entirely solid. The Champ de Mars, the broad field chosen as the site of the tower, lay on the banks of the river Seine. The soil there was soft in places, and the water table was high. Building something as unprecedented as a 300-meter iron tower on such terrain was no small challenge. Gustave Eiffel knew that the tower's stability depended entirely on the foundations. If they were weak, the whole structure would be vulnerable. And so, in January of 1887, his team of engineers and workers began the slow, methodical task of preparing the ground. 4 massive masonry pedestals would be built, one for each leg of the tower. These pedestals had to be sunk deep enough to bear the weight of thousands of tons of iron and to resist the push of the wind that would strike the tower as it rose into the sky. The western legs, those furthest from the river, were relatively straightforward. Workers dug deep pits into the soil until they reached firm ground. They then filled these pits with thick layers of stone and concrete, creating platforms strong enough to carry the load. But the eastern legs, closest to the Seine, were a different matter. There, the water threatened to flood the excavation pits as soon as digging began. To solve this, Eiffel's engineers employed a technique that was innovative for the time: compressed air caissons. These were large, watertight chambers made of iron, opened at the bottom. Workers would be lowered into these caissons, where pumps forced in compressed air to hold back the water. Inside this artificial environment, men dug through the wet soil by hand, shoveling it away to reach the firm ground below. It was dangerous work. The compressed air could cause health problems, and the risk of accidents was always present. Yet day after day, the laborers pressed on. Imagine the scene: men working by lamplight inside dark chambers beneath the earth, the hiss of air pumps filling their ears, the weight of the river pressing above them. Outside, cranes lifted away the mud and stone they removed. Slowly, steadily, the foundations for the eastern legs took shape. Once the pits were dug deep enough, concrete was poured in, creating a base as solid as bedrock. By mid-1887, the foundations were complete. On top of the stone and concrete pedestals, 4 enormous masonry blocks were constructed, each aligned with absolute precision. It was on these blocks that the tower's iron legs would be anchored. Eiffel insisted on exact measurements. Even the slightest error in alignment could have disastrous consequences once the ironwork began to rise. Surveyors checked and rechecked the levels, ensuring that every pedestal was in perfect position. It is easy to overlook the foundations of a monument. Visitors to the tower today rarely give them much thought. They are hidden beneath the graceful arches and the lattice of iron. Yet without them, the tower could not exist. They are its unseen strength, the quiet guarantee that the structure above will endure. The completion of the foundations marked a turning point. For months, Parisians had read about the tower, argued about it, mocked it, or defended it, but all they had seen so far was digging and masonry. Now, with the foundations complete, the moment was approaching when iron would rise above the Champ de Mars. The iron monster, as critics called it, was about to take physical shape. For the workers, the foundations had been exhausting labor, yet they had also built a sense of pride. Many of them were ordinary men, recruited from across Paris and beyond, who had never before worked on something of such scale. They did not know what the finished tower would look like, or whether it would be loved or hated, but they knew that their hands were part of history. Gustave Eiffel himself visited the site often. Though he trusted his engineers, he was meticulous. He would walk the excavations, checking progress, discussing techniques, urging caution where needed. He understood that the foundations were the most important part of the entire project. Once they were complete, he was confident that the tower would stand. By the summer of 1887, the site was ready. The masonry blocks were solid, the anchor bolts were set, waiting for the iron pieces that would be delivered from Eiffel's factory in Levallois-Perret, just outside Paris. Already in that factory, thousands of iron components were being prepared. Each piece was precisely measured, drilled, and numbered, ready to fit into place like a gigantic three-dimensional puzzle. The foundations were finished, the ground was steady, the stage was set. Soon the people of Paris would look up and see something they had never seen before: the first beams of the Eiffel Tower rising into the sky. With the foundations firmly in place, the real spectacle of the Eiffel Tower could finally begin. Until then, critics had mocked the project as little more than a hole in the ground, a waste of money and labor. But in the summer of 1887, something new appeared on the Champ de Mars: iron. The iron beams and girders that would form the tower were not produced on site. They were carefully manufactured in Eiffel's workshop at Levallois-Perret, just outside Paris. There, more than 2 million rivet holes were drilled into thousands of iron pieces. Each part was measured, cut, and numbered with meticulous precision. Nothing was left to chance. When shipped to the construction site, the beams were like pieces of a colossal kit. Each had its place, and every hole had to line up exactly with its partner. At the site, teams of workers began to assemble the pieces. They started with the lower legs, bolting and riveting the beams together to form the massive arches that would support the whole tower. The work was slow, noisy, and dangerous. Riveting crews became the heart of the operation. Their process was as old-fashioned as it was effective. A white-hot rivet was pulled from a forge, tossed, yes, tossed from one man to another with tongues, caught in a bucket, and hammered into place before it cooled. The air rang with the clang of hammers and the hiss of steam. Day after day, the skeleton of the tower grew. By the autumn of 1887, the first level began to take shape. It was here that the critics grew silent for the first time. From afar, Parisians could now see the outlines of something enormous emerging above the Champ de Mars. The legs, which critics had imagined as ungainly, began to curve upward with an unexpected elegance. They rose like the roots of a giant tree, sloping inward and narrowing as they reached for the sky. What had been called a monstrous chimney now started to look like something altogether different, graceful. But building was not without peril. The height was unlike anything most workers had ever experienced. Eiffel was determined to make the site as safe as possible. He required safety rails, guard ropes, and even movable platforms to prevent falls. Helmets were introduced, which was unusual for the time. Despite these precautions, the danger was ever present. Riveters balanced on narrow beams hundreds of feet above the ground, with only the wind for company. Remarkably, very few workers lost their lives, far fewer than in other major projects of the era. Eiffel took pride in this, calling worker safety as important as structural safety. By March of 1888, the tower had reached the first platform, about 57 meters above the ground. From this height, Parisians could already see the city from a perspective few had ever experienced. The skeptics grumbled, but the sheer physical presence of the structure could not be ignored. The iron giant was rising, and nothing could stop it. Construction pressed on. As the legs rose higher, ingenious scaffolding and temporary wooden supports were erected to hold the beams in place until the structure could support itself. Steam-powered cranes mounted on tracks that climbed up the legs, hoisted pieces ever higher. Each new level was a fresh challenge in logistics and precision. Thousands of parts had to fit together perfectly. If even a single measurement was off, the entire structure would be compromised. By the summer of 1888, the second platform was reached, at 115 meters above the ground. The tower now loomed over Paris, visible from every quarter of the city. The protests continued, but their tone had shifted. What had been mocked as impossible was now undeniable. People could argue about whether it was beautiful, but no one could deny that it was extraordinary. At the site, the mood was a mix of pride and exhaustion. Workers endured long days, heat in the summer, and bitter winds in the winter as they climbed higher. Yet many felt they were part of something historic. Families would bring children to watch the tower grow. Street vendors sold refreshments to crowds who gathered to gawk at the rising structure. The iron monster was becoming a spectacle in its own right. By December 1888, the tower had reached the third platform, about 276 meters high. The pace slowed as the structure grew more complex. The upper sections required smaller, lighter beams, and the cranes had to be carefully maneuvered. Yet progress continued steadily. Each day, Paris awoke to find the tower a little taller, its silhouette cutting more sharply into the skyline. The final stretch was the most challenging. The tower's summit required delicate assembly of the narrow spire, which would ultimately carry the French flag. In March of 1889, with the World's Fair just weeks away, Eiffel himself climbed to the top. At nearly 300 meters above the city, he raised the tricolor flag of France. The moment was triumphant. The tower was complete. The statistics were staggering. Over 18,000 individual iron parts had been used, held together by 2.5 million rivets. The entire structure weighed over 10,000 tons, and yet, for all its size, the tower stood balanced and graceful, a lattice of iron that seemed almost delicate against the sky. For the workers, it was the end of 2 years of grueling labor. For Eiffel, it was vindication. His tower had not collapsed, as critics predicted. It had not ruined the skyline, as artists feared. Instead, it had risen higher than any structure in history, and it stood firm. For the people of Paris, it was something new, something they had never seen before, a view of their city from the heavens. Visitors who climbed the stairs to the first, second, and third platforms were awestruck by the panorama. Paris stretched before them like a map, its boulevards radiating, its monuments small in comparison to the iron colossus on which they stood. The iron giants had risen. The tower was no longer a dream, no longer a set of blueprints, no longer a hole in the ground. It was real. By early 1889, the Eiffel Tower stood complete. What had begun as an audacious sketch and a target of ridicule had now risen into a reality of iron and rivets, towering nearly 300 meters above Paris. The timing could not have been more dramatic. The Exposition Universelle, the Grand World's Fair of 1889, was about to open, and the tower was set to be its crown jewel. The fair was no ordinary celebration. It marked 100 years since the French Revolution, a centennial of liberty and change. Nations from around the globe were preparing to showcase their finest inventions, industries, and cultural treasures. Paris itself was transforming into a festival ground, filled with pavilions, exhibits, and performances. Millions of visitors were expected, and dominating it all was the new tower, an iron sentinel that announced to the world France was modern, France was bold, and France was unafraid to embrace the future. In the weeks leading up to the opening, Eiffel and his team worked feverishly to prepare the tower for its debut. Though the ironwork was complete, finishing touches remained. Platforms were fitted with railings, restaurants were installed, staircases were secured, and elevators were tested. The elevators were a particular fascination. Designed by the American firm Otis, they were unlike anything most people had ever seen. Rising diagonally along the tower's curved legs before straightening as they climbed higher, the elevators were feats of engineering in their own right. To the public, they seemed almost magical. Finally, on March 31st, 1889, Gustave Eiffel himself led a group of dignitaries and officials up the tower. The elevators were not yet operational, so the climb was made by foot. Step by step, they ascended the 1,710 stairs. At the summit, Eiffel planted the French flag. The tricolor fluttered in the cold spring air, high above the city, visible from miles away. Paris had a new pinnacle. The opening of the Exposition Universelle in May brought floods of visitors from around the world. They came by train, by carriage, even by boat along the Seine. Paris was alive with energy, the boulevards crowded with people speaking dozens of languages. The fairgrounds offered wonders of every kind: electric lights, machinery, exotic displays from faraway colonies, and cultural performances. But the centerpiece, the sight no one could ignore, was the Eiffel Tower. From the moment the gates opened, crowds streamed toward it. Some were eager, others hesitant. Critics had not been silenced. Many visitors approached with skepticism, ready to scoff at what they had been told was an ugly monstrosity. But standing beneath it, gazing up at its soaring height, most were stunned into silence. The tower did not simply dominate the fair, it redefined it. To stand at its base was to feel small, as if one were looking at a mountain made by human hands. To climb it was to embark on an adventure. Those who braved the stairs, or later the elevators, were rewarded with a view unlike anything they had ever imagined. Paris lay spread out in every direction, its boulevards and monuments tiny beneath the iron lattice. The Seine curled through the city like a silver ribbon. In the distance, hills and forests framed the horizon. Visitors described the experience with awe, often struggling to find words for the feeling of standing so high above the world. For Eiffel, the fair was vindication. The tower became the most popular attraction of the exposition. More than 2 million people climbed it during the fair's 6-month run. The critics who had mocked it as a giant smokestack now found themselves eating their words. While some still grumbled about its appearance, the sheer popularity of the tower could not be denied. And the tower was not only a spectacle, it was also a stage for science. Eiffel arranged for meteorological instruments to be installed, measuring wind speed, temperature, and barometric pressure at different altitudes. Scientists climbed the tower to conduct experiments, using its height as a natural laboratory. In later years, radio transmitters would be placed there, transforming it into a hub of communication. But even in its first year, the tower was already serving as more than just decoration. The tower also became a social space. At the first and second levels, restaurants offered meals to visitors, turning the climb into not just an adventure, but an outing. Families dined while overlooking the city, and businessmen entertained clients with panoramic views. The third level, near the top, offered a smaller platform and a sense of intimacy with the sky. Parisians who had mocked the tower soon found themselves returning again and again, drawn by its novelty and its unmatched vistas. Not everyone was won over, of course. Some critics remained bitter. The famous novelist Guy de Maupassant reportedly continued to despise the tower, though legend has it he often ate lunch in its restaurant, claiming it was the only place in Paris where he couldn't see the structure. Whether the story is true or not, it reflects the tension many Parisians felt. They could not love the tower, but they could not ignore it. As the fair drew to a close, one thing was clear. The Eiffel Tower had become more than a temporary exhibit. It was supposed to be dismantled after 20 years, its iron sold for scrap, but already it was hard to imagine Paris without it. Visitors from across the world carried home postcards and photographs, spreading its image far and wide. The tower was becoming international, a symbol not only of Paris, but of modernity itself. For Gustave Eiffel, the success was bittersweet. The Panama scandal was still haunting him, tarnishing his name even as his tower triumphed. Yet, when he stood at its summit, gazing out over the city, he could feel a sense of accomplishment few men have ever known. Against all odds, against ridicule and doubt, he had built the tallest structure on Earth. As the Exposition Universelle closed in November of 1889, the tower remained. It had been born as a temporary attraction, a bold but fleeting experiment. Yet, already it seemed destined to endure. Paris had asked for a wonder, and Gustave Eiffel had given it one, an iron mountain that touched the sky. The Eiffel Tower opened to the world in 1889 as the centerpiece of the Exposition Universelle. It was a triumph in engineering, a magnet for visitors, and an undeniable marvel. Yet, in the eyes of many Parisians, it was still ugly. When the fair ended and the crowds dispersed, the question hung in the air: what would become of this iron giant? The original agreement between Eiffel's company and the city of Paris granted him the right to operate the tower for 20 years. After that, in 1909, it was supposed to be dismantled. The idea had always been that the tower was temporary, a kind of exhibition stunt that would be removed when its novelty faded. For critics, this was a relief. For Eiffel, it was a looming deadline. Throughout the 1890s, the debate raged. On one side were those who still considered the tower an eyesore. The artists' protest group, who had denounced it before construction, continued to grumble. Writers described it as a skeleton dominating the skyline, robbing Paris of its grace. Painters avoided including it in their landscapes, or else depicted it as a blot. Some Parisians openly counted the years until it would finally be torn down. On the other hand, however, something new was happening: affection. The tower had been embraced by visitors, both foreign and local. It became a place to stroll, to dine, to climb for the view. Couples walked beneath its arches. Families brought children to marvel at its height. Postcards carried its image across Europe and beyond. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Paris began to accept it. But acceptance was not enough to guarantee survival. To secure the tower's future, Eiffel needed to prove it was useful. He was a practical man as much as a visionary, and he knew beauty alone would not save it. Science might. Eiffel threw himself into experiments. He installed meteorological instruments on the platforms, taking daily readings of temperature, pressure, and wind speed. These measurements, published in scientific journals, showed the value of the tower as a laboratory in the sky. He studied the effect of wind on tall structures, using the tower to gather data that would guide future engineers. In an era before airplanes, it offered a unique window into the upper atmosphere. In 1903, another use emerged: radio. The French military began experimenting with antennas on the tower, realizing its height made it ideal for transmitting signals over long distances. By 1906, a permanent radio station was installed. Suddenly, the tower was not just a tourist attraction, but a vital tool of national defense and communication. This, more than anything else, secured its survival. When 1909 arrived, the city could not justify tearing down a structure that was already proving indispensable. Meanwhile, the tower's reputation shifted in the public imagination. What had once been derided as a monstrous chimney began to appear in paintings, posters, and advertisements. Artists who had once cursed it now used it as a symbol of modernity. Writers referenced it as a marker of Paris, a shorthand for the city itself. Photographers, especially, embraced it. Its iron lattice cast dramatic shadows and offered bold lines against the sky. The very features that critics had mocked, its starkness, its lack of ornament, became its strength in an age that was beginning to embrace modern design. By the turn of the century, the tower was no longer merely tolerated, it was celebrated. Tourists came from across the world to climb it. Parisians, whether they admitted it or not, grew accustomed to its presence, even fond of it. It was becoming inseparable from the city's identity. Still, some resistance lingered. Guy de Maupassant, who had signed the original protest, never softened. He famously declared that he lunched at the tower's restaurant because it was the only place in Paris where he could not see the structure. Others agreed, insisting that Paris had been disfigured, but these voices grew fewer, drowned out by the steady rise of affection. Eiffel himself, though tainted by the Panama Canal scandal, found comfort in the tower's growing role as a scientific instrument. After withdrawing from major construction, he devoted his later years to research. He used the tower to study aerodynamics, dropping objects to test resistance, and conducting experiments that would later contribute to the birth of aviation. To him, the tower was always more than a monument. It was a tool, a platform, a contribution to knowledge. The irony is striking. What saved the Eiffel Tower was not its beauty, nor its popularity, but its usefulness. It survived because it could transmit messages, because it could serve science. The very things that critics hated, its starkness, its industrial nature, were the reasons it endured. By the early 20th century, the tower had passed a turning point. It was no longer a temporary intruder, but a permanent resident. Paris could not imagine its skyline without it. Visitors spoke of it with awe. Journalists described it as the pride of France. What had been mocked as an ugly pile was on its way to becoming a national treasure. And yet, its trials were not over. The tower would still face the tests of history. 2 world wars that would threaten its existence and challenge its resilience. But it had survived its most precarious years. It had survived ridicule, hatred, and the risk of demolition. Against the odds, it stood firm. The Iron Giant had endured long enough to win over its harshest critics. Slowly but surely, it was becoming not just part of Paris, but the very symbol of Paris. The Eiffel Tower had survived ridicule, protest, and the threat of demolition. By the dawn of the 20th century, it was no longer a temporary exhibition structure, but a fixture of Paris. Yet its greatest tests were still to come. Twice in the century ahead, war would engulf Europe. Twice, Paris would find itself in danger. And twice, the Eiffel Tower would stand, battered but unbowed, its story entwined with the story of France itself. When the First World War broke out in 1914, the tower had already proven its value as a tool for communication. Antennas mounted on its summit had extended the reach of French radio signals far beyond what had once been possible. As the German army advanced toward Paris in the early months of the war, the tower became more than a monument. It became a weapon. French forces used its radio transmitters to intercept enemy communications and coordinate troop movements. In September of 1914, during the First Battle of the Marne, messages sent from the tower helped direct French reinforcements at a critical moment. Many historians believe these signals played a decisive role in halting the German advance and saving Paris from capture. Throughout the war, the tower continued to serve. It transmitted orders, intercepted signals, and stood as a silent sentinel over the city. For Parisians living through the uncertainty of those years, it became a symbol of resilience. While shells fell in the distance and soldiers marched to the front, the tower loomed above them, unchanged, a reminder of continuity in a world of upheaval. When peace finally came in 1918, the Eiffel Tower emerged not as a relic, but as a hero of sorts. It had proven its worth in ways even Gustave Eiffel himself might not have foreseen. No longer could critics dismiss it as useless. The tower had saved lives, defended the city, and justified its existence beyond question. The interwar years saw the tower flourish as a tourist destination once again. Visitors came from across Europe and beyond to climb its platforms and marvel at its views. Advances in lighting technology allowed it to be illuminated at night, turning it into a beacon above the Paris skyline. Artists who had once despised it now painted it with affection. Writers referenced it with pride. Paris and the tower had become inseparable in the global imagination. But darker days lay ahead. In 1940, German troops marched into Paris. The city fell without a fight, and Adolf Hitler himself visited soon after to bask in the victory. He toured the city's monuments, including the Eiffel Tower. Famously, when German forces occupied Paris, the French cut the lift cables of the tower. This meant that if Hitler wanted to ascend to the summit, he would have to climb the stairs. He chose not to. Photographs from his visit show him standing below the tower, gazing upward, but never conquering its heights. For Parisians, this act of quiet defiance, disabling the lifts, became a source of pride. The tower might be occupied, but it had not bowed. During the occupation, the tower stood in silence. German flags flew from its platforms. Soldiers patrolled its base. Yet it endured, untouched by bombs or sabotage. As the war dragged on, it became a symbol of waiting for liberation, waiting for the city to be free once more. In 1944, as Allied forces approached Paris, Hitler reportedly ordered that the city be destroyed rather than surrendered. His general, Dietrich von Kolchitz, famously disobeyed. The bridges were not blown, the monuments were not demolished, and the Eiffel Tower survived once again. When Paris was liberated in August of that year, the French flag once more flew proudly from its summit. Crowds cheered in the streets, and the tower, standing tall above them, seemed to share in the celebration. The decades after the war were years of renewal for the tower. It required maintenance, repainting, and modernization. Its elevators were repaired and improved. Its platforms were updated to handle the growing number of tourists who flocked to see it. By the 1950s and 60s, It had become the most visited monument in the world. What had begun as a temporary exhibit was now an international destination. In the post-war world, the Eiffel Tower also became a global symbol. It appeared on posters, postcards, and films. It was the backdrop to love stories, political speeches, and world events. Its silhouette was instantly recognizable. To speak of Paris was to conjure the tower. To speak of France was often to picture it. And yet, even as it became an icon, it remained a working structure. New antennas were installed, extending its role as a hub for communication. Television broadcasts used its height to beam signals across the region. Meteorologists continued to use it for measurements. Scientists still found value in its lofty platforms. The tower was not just a monument to the past, it was part of the present. Through the late 20th century, the Eiffel Tower underwent restorations to ensure its survival into the future. Layers of paint, applied again and again over the decades, were carefully stripped and reapplied. Engineers inspected its rivets and beams, reinforcing where needed. The goal was to preserve not just its appearance, but its strength. By the time the tower celebrated its centennial in 1989, it was firmly established as one of the most beloved structures in the world. The same city that had once petitioned to destroy it now treated it as a national treasure. The irony could not have been greater. What had been mocked as an iron monstrosity was now the pride of Paris, a symbol of resilience through war, of survival through scandal, and of renewal in peace. Today, the Eiffel Tower continues to stand as a testament to endurance. It has seen empires rise and fall, wars begin and end, generations come and go. It has been hated, defended, occupied, celebrated, and adored. Yet through it all, it has remained. For visitors standing beneath its arches, looking up at the lattice of iron that stretches into the sky, it is easy to forget how close the tower once came to being demolished. It is easy to forget that wars once threatened it, or that critics once despised it. What remains is the simple truth: the Eiffel Tower endured. It endured because of science, because of resilience, because of the stubborn determination of those who believed in it. And it endures still, as a symbol of Paris, of France, and of the human desire to reach ever higher. And so, the story of the Eiffel Tower comes to a close, or rather it continues, because the tower itself still stands, watching over Paris. Its tale is one of vision, controversy, risk, scandal, triumph, and endurance. Few monuments in the world carry so many layers of meaning, and fewer still have traveled such a long road from rejection to adoration. When we look at the tower today, glowing at night with thousands of lights, we tend to forget the outrage it once inspired. We forget that Paris's artists and intellectuals called it monstrous, that newspapers mocked it, that its demolition was once scheduled. We forget that it was seen as an intruder in a city of stone and elegance. Instead, we see it as it is now, graceful, majestic, unmistakable.
The tower's story reminds us that innovation often appears strange at first. Every era has its critics, its guardians of tradition who fear change. Eiffel's design challenged the taste of his time, pushing Paris into the industrial age whether it wanted to go or not. And though the protests were loud, they faded as the tower proved itself, not only as a marvel of engineering, but as a useful tool, a beacon, and eventually,
as a beloved companion of the city. It is also the story of Gustave Eiffel himself. In the same year that his tower was unveiled to the world, he faced disgrace in the Panama Canal scandal. He knew the sting of public ridicule and the burden of accusation. Yet his tower stood above it all, outlasting the scandal, outlasting even his own lifetime. Today, his name is remembered not for the courtroom, but for the monument that touches the sky. The tower teaches another lesson too, that survival often depends on adaptability. It endured not because it was beautiful, not because it was loved, but because it proved useful. It became a laboratory for science, a platform for radio, a tool for defense, and only later, a symbol of romance and art. In this way, it mirrors the human spirit. We survived by finding new purposes, by adapting to challenges, by proving our worth in unexpected ways. And through wars and peace, through ridicule and celebration, the Eiffel Tower endured. It watched the German army march into Paris and saw them leave again. It carried the French flag through the storm of 2 world wars. It became a beacon of resilience in dark times and a beacon of joy in brighter days. It survived not only as a monument of iron and rivets, but as a monument of spirit. Tonight, as we reflect on its story, imagine standing beneath it. The iron arches rise above you, narrowing as they climb into the sky. The lattice seems delicate, almost lace-like, yet it carries the weight of 10,000 tons. Around you, Paris hums with life. The Seine flows, the boulevards stretch outward, the lights of the city twinkle, and above it all, the tower watches, as it has for more than a century. The Eiffel Tower is no longer the hated, ugly pile of 1889. It is the beloved heart of Paris, the monument that greets travelers, lovers, and dreamers. It is proof that what begins in ridicule can end in reverence, proof that boldness can outlast doubt, proof that some visions, once realized, are too strong to ever fade away. And so, as we close this journey through its history, let the tower remind us of the power of resilience and imagination. For every age has its wonders, and every generation its doubters. But sometimes, from iron and vision, from courage and controversy, something rises that endures forever.